Now?
Live, so let's start. Thank you so much.
All right.
So you have 353. By the way, you studied in Kirodimar College. You're studying in Kirodimar College, is it?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Kirodimal
Yeah,
College, University of Delhi.
my
I'm a
wife
recent
studied.
graduate.
You
Oh,
have
wow.
already
That's
graduated.
lovely.
Okay.
Yeah. This year I got graduated.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Also,
Yeah. Okay.
Professor, we'll be starting live in the next 30 minutes so that we give some time for our audience on YouTube and Facebook to join in.
Okay.
And we'll be very shortly starting. And all right.
The clock is going up rather than down. What does that mean? Are we already
Live
live?
in, yeah, it's already live.
Oh, okay. So whenever
So
you're ready.
yeah. So I guess it's time now. So yeah, a very good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for the very first session of Anveshana, which is an expert discussion, a series of expert discussions and Q&As to help our young leaders from all across to understand more about issues which we face as a society in 21st century. My name is Dave Nagar, and I have the pleasure of hosting one of our very special guests for this evening, Professor S. Viswanathan. Thank you so much, Professor, for being here.
My pleasure.
Professor Viswanathan would be speaking on a theme that has been set for this month, that is sustainable business. And before I go ahead, I would like to have the honor of introducing Professor Viswanathan to all of you. So, Professor S. Viswanathan is Professor of Operations, Management and Corporate Sustainability at Nanyang Business School, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. He also serves as the Director of the Center of Business Sustainability and as Cluster Director of Energy Research Institute at NTU itself. Professor's expertise are in corporate sustainability, sustainable operations and supply chains, operations management, inventory theory, and optimization. He currently teaches in master's, PhD, MBA, EMBA, and executive programs at his university. His research has been published in Financial Times, BusinessWeek, among other prestigious top-tier business journals in the field. He has also made several appearances in Who's Who in the World, Who's Who in Asia, Who's Who in Finance and Industry, and Who's Who in Science and Engineering lists. He was also awarded the prestigious Nanyang Award for Research Excellence in the year 2010. We thank Professor Viswanathan again for accepting our invite and being kind enough for taking out time for this event. Before we move ahead, I would like to brief our audience the structure for today's event. The first 5 to 10 minutes, Professor would be talking very briefly about what sustainable business mean. And next, we would be taking up some predetermined set of questions which have already been taken up by our community members. And after that, in the last 20 minutes, we would open the stage for our audience to join us live and ask questions directly to Professor Vish. Professor, my first question to you would be, since we are in a time when the whole world is recovering from the devastation caused by the coronavirus pandemic, and we also see that there is a very renewed spark for rapid development across societies, and because of it, it becomes very imperative for our policymakers and our governments to take into perspective how we can shape our development more sustainably, and hence come in picture sustainable business. So, since our audience is very diverse and from very diverse backgrounds, so just to make it a little easier for them to understand what sustainable business mean in a layman's language, I would request you to go ahead and please enlighten our audience. Thank you so much, Professor. To you.
Thank you, Dev. First of all, I'd like to thank you as well as your team for inviting me to be the first speaker in this series, as well as your kind introduction just a few minutes ago. So let me try to give you a layman's viewpoint of what sustainable business is. And please feel free to ask follow-up questions in case it's not clear, because um as I said, you already explained that I teach at a full course on sustainability, and I do a lot of research. So it might not be easy to come up with a very simple way of introducing right at the beginning. So let me probably take a maybe the best way to define it is to go through my own understanding of it and my own journey over the last 15 years. As your introduction mentioned, I started off as a person in optimization and operations management. So I used to teach operations management and supply chain. I still do teach those subjects and I still do research in that. But about 15 years ago, I started doing work on closed loop supply chain, reverse logistics. And then the university itself got into sustainability. That's when I started launching a MBA elective in corporate sustainability. And from there, I started doing quite a bit of research on it. So sustainability, sometimes, even if you go and talk to some old-timer business professor who has done work in strategy, sometimes sustainability just means sustainable. Is the business sustainable for the long term? If you go and talk to the startup folks, they'll say, is the business model sustainable? There we are using a different meaning of sustainability, meaning that will the business itself thrive over a period of time, right? But today's world, when people talk about sustainability, they're not talking about whether the business itself will thrive. We do have, depending on the industry, certain industries like oil and gas businesses thrive for hundreds of years. But if you look at the software sector, the average lifetime of successful industries is actually sometimes successful companies is sometimes pretty low. Microsoft, by software industry's terms, probably is 1,000 years old, because many of the other, there used to be a software called Lotus 123 we used to use for spreadsheets. That doesn't exist anymore, and it got bought over by different folks and so on. So we are not talking about sustainability in terms of longevity of the businesses. We are talking about sustainability in terms of survival of human beings in the planet itself, right? Because when people say, oh, the planet is in danger, the planet is not in danger. I mean, we are just one of the hundreds of millions of species that is surviving here. I guess we have become a victim of our own success. Men have always tried to invent new methods, new processes, new technologies to sort of improve our lives, right? Maybe thousands of years ago, you used elephant as earth-moving equipment to move wood and trees, and that's how we constructed buildings. And we hear about stories of how the pyramid, or how even the Taj Mahal was built by essentially manually by workers. From there, we have used technology. People have heard about industrial revolution and so on. But these technologies, without our realization, the yesterday's technology can become today's problems. That's what the world is. That doesn't mean that technology is bad. Why is sustainability becoming very important for business now? Because many of the large businesses are larger than the countries. Ultimately, value in any society is actually provided by private enterprise that creates the goods and services that people need, and then they create value. But if you look at it from an individual's point of view, every maybe tens of thousands of years ago, there weren't enough human beings in this planet. So you could actually argue that those days, even a fossil fuel was a renewable fuel, because ultimately, when we all die and we go back into the earth, we get renewed back as coal or carbon or fuel. But it's just that because the population has grown up so much, we are consuming the resource at a rate faster than their natural replenishment cycle. So that's the one part. We are consuming too much of resources. The second part is climate change, which the whole world debated whether climate change is real or not. But now we are sort of, most of the people are in agreement, except probably 50% in America, that climate change is real. And if we don't take action on it in the next 20, 30 to 40 years, by the turn of the century, we'll see more devastating effects. Some people argue that even the weather effects we see now is related to climate change. The third part is today businesses have become far more profitable. So offline, you talked about the startup fever in India, right? People want to start companies. Why do they want to start companies? Of course, there's a lot of excitement in it. You get some pleasure or implicit satisfaction out of satisfying a need for a society. But ultimately, it's money. So the way the society is rewarding success itself, in a way, turns into a situation where we have a few big winners who take most of the profits out, or the rent out of businesses. And most businesses are very global, and the supply chains are very global. So you could have a product that requires coffee or cocoa or other commodities. But ultimately, the poor people very upstream in the supply chain either hardly get any of the results for the hard labor. They get a very small percentage. Besides, they actually incur what do you call negative externalities. Maybe the owners of the factories in Bangladesh that supplies the garments to the Western countries, they don't because their margins are squeezed. They don't take care of health and safety as well. So the sustainability is not just about climate change or resources. It's also about making sure that not just the people within the four walls of your organization are treated well, but people who eventually contribute to making your product or service, whether they are located in India, Bangladesh, Mongolia, anywhere, are also having a life that is purposeful and meaning, and are getting just rewards for it. So after learning all this, I even accidentally, in one of the projects, I accidentally bumped into Mahatma Gandhi's work way back in 1942. In fact, it appeared in I think in a journal called Harijan in 1942, where he talks about trusteeship. And what Gandhi actually advocated almost 80 years ago is that private entrepreneurs should run businesses as trustees, use the wealth they create to improve society after keeping a reasonable profit for themselves. So if you want my definition of sustainable business, one should not confuse with triple bottom line. Yes, businesses need to make money, but businesses should not be greedy. Ultimately, it's not about profit all the time or making sure there is a trade-off. You need to also give back to society and make sure that the business is actually in harmony with the people around it, as well as with the planet, the environment around it. So that's probably a longish definition of what sustainable business is. Right?
Thank you so much, Professor, for putting it in perspective. Because whenever we talk about sustainability, most of us confuse sustainability just view sustainability from a green lens, as in from an ecological preservation perspective. But there are so many threads to it, which you right now mentioned. And as you also mentioned about the startups and how there is also you quoted Gandhi about small enterprises. So I would like to bring into the perspective for the audience that since in a country like India, where there is a lot of impetus being given to the startup ecosystem, wherein the government is pitching as in entrepreneurship is the most lucrative choice for young people to take up. How do you think that this global goals that are the sustainable development goals by the UN, do they serve as the optimal reference point where they can modulate their operations and functioning in a manner? And do you think that there are other measures through which they can make their whole operations right from the scratch more sustainable and ethical in that sense?
Okay. That's a pretty loaded question. You talk about startups, you talk about SDGs. Before I come to startups, since you asked about SDGs, let me talk about established businesses itself. And this is my own personal perspective. What to me, SDGs are what I call from a business point of view, right? From a country point of view, there are agencies that try to evaluate the performance of countries and of states. In India, I think the national government actually, Niti Aayog actually publishes a report. And I believe Kerala has done the best in terms of attaining of course, it goes into statistical measurements and so on. But from a company's perspective, if I'm making, let's say, electronic chips that goes into some other company's products, how do I connect myself to no poverty or zero hunger, right? Sometimes it's a bit difficult. So to me, sometimes SDGs are sort of end goals or goals for the purpose of communicating to your stakeholders. Internally, sometimes it's actually difficult to grapple with SDGs and figure out if I'm in this particular business, which has nothing to do with zero hunger, how do I actually connect to it, right? So much so that I believe sometimes all companies, when they publish their sustainability reports, they use the SDG as a reference, and it can actually lead to what's called greenwashing, because maybe no poverty or zero hunger has nothing connected with my business, and then I go and serve an unrelated community, go and build some few homes there, give out some food, and I say, oh, I have actually contributed to reducing zero hunger by distributing food in a particular village. It's actually a good thing, they're doing charity, but what one needs to look at is what is the negative externality they create in their own business. Maybe there is a supply chain that is tens of thousands of miles away from their home base, where their workers are actually being treated very badly that they're not even aware of. So they need to probably clean up their own homes first before they start doing charity, in a sense. That's my take on SDGs for large businesses. When you talk about small businesses and sustainability and SDGs itself, the typical reaction of small businesses is, "Oh, we are too small. We don't even have a business viability yet. How do we actually address these goals?" Which is a rightful point. So you need to look at the context of a particular business, right? So if you are, let's say, a company that is providing last mile, I think we need to take specific examples here. Let's say it's a startup. It's providing last mile delivery solutions for delivering food for clients, right? How can you adopt the SDG goals, right? So that it becomes a huge challenge, uh, because you probably haven't even reached break even. You need to make sure your business model works. But then maybe what I would sort of encourage youngsters at that point to see is, can you actually somehow do things while you're doing this business model, in terms of maybe even small things that can address problem. For example, in your own businesses, as a last mile delivery person, how can you eliminate wastage that occurs, right? How do we, is there a way that you can reinvent the dabbawala model that is famous in Mumbai, when you deliver food to customers, rather than using plastics or paper that eventually goes out of as waste? So even as a small business, when you think of last mile delivery, you might not have a choice, because you're actually just doing the delivery. You're not actually working with the restaurants. The restaurant is actually doing the packing. But because you're doing the last mile delivery, can you talk to at least some of the restaurants? Maybe the restaurants will say go to hell, because they have other people who can actually do the last mile delivery. So you need to see, obviously you need to make a trade-off, but in everything that you do, you can see, uh, am I creating a negative externality, or creating unwanted things for the environment that I can try to avoid in the process? Of course, when you get to a stage where you start making money, maybe you could adopt Gandhi's philosophy. So because you're able to deliver, you're doing this delivery of food, maybe you create your own food itself. Or maybe you find that when you work with these restaurants, there's actually a lot of food wastage that happens, where they just throw it down dig it into the earth, or just throw it down, and which actually becomes a urban municipal waste, which is not treated well. Is there a way, while you do make money doing delivery, is there a way you can actually create where the leftover food at the end of the day can be donated to charity, or you can donate it personally to people who are in need of it, right? Those are ways, I think, you need to think very basic, rather than uh, I mean, ultimately, after you think basic and you come up with some of these solutions, then you can possibly develop a strategy framework to really address how you can become more sustainable. But I believe, even as a small company, right from when you design the processes, you can look at what is the bad things I am creating, and how can I mitigate the bad things and make it as minimal as possible.
Thank you so much, Professor. Also, earlier you mentioned that there are some companies, which indeed is true, which have become so mammoth, as in like they are even larger than nations, and hence comes into picture the monopoly that they have over everything. So right now you see that these companies are moving towards sustainability, and slowly we are moving towards like a world wherein by 2030 we have targets to many big companies have targets to go net zero. So how do you think that even going net zero, as in like in terms of sustainable business model, do you think it's a successful thing? Like when we talk, for instance, in India, India is not setting a net zero target because they think that it's not rational to do so, because the global south has always been like it didn't get the equal amount of time that the global north has. So when it comes to these companies, do you think when it comes to India, do you think the whole sustainability concept in terms of net zero targets, do you think it's kind of productive
Yeah,
to
so
set net zero targets?
I guess I don't want to get too much into net zero targets, because that's not my expertise. My expertise is more in terms of how can companies try to abate their emissions, make things more sustainable. And what I do is I do actually show the SDG slides, but I bring in my own sustainable, what I call sustainable impact reference framework. I don't want to talk about that framework in this event, because that itself will take a long time. But to go back to your question about is net zero a good target to have? It depends on countries. I guess right now what's happening is there is some kind of peer pressure happening with companies as well as with countries. So you find that not only do are companies giving these targets, some countries have also made these announcements. There are two ways to look at it, right? Let me give an example. Let's say you are in 8th standard, and when you're in 8th standard in a relatively unknown school in some small town in India, and then your father says, "Oh, you do have some skill sets for science and engineering. I want you to get into IIT," right? And you say, "I want to get into IIT." But I mean, out of how many, maybe 50 lakh people who apply for engineering, not everybody gets into IIT. That's an aspirational statement that you make as a young kid who's 12 or 13, and you don't even know where you'll get there. And even when you are in college, you set some targets for yourself, and those are long-term targets. And you could say that maybe the companies are trying to put ambitious target and saying we want to be net zero. But and the idea is that if you at least say that, oh, if I want to be, and I gave the example of IIT, one could give the same thing for a cricket player. I want to be as good as a particular bowler. Even if you don't get there, if you probably get 1/20th of that, maybe you have achieved your target, right? That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is that many observers look at it cynically and say they are trying to sort of fend off their sort of the NGOs or media who's trying to criticize them. So there are two views to it. Yes, India has not agreed to a net zero target yet. So is Singapore, because Singapore is a small island. We don't, at least in India, you can generate solar power in the deserts in Rajasthan. And what I was told in a seminar by an expert from IIT is that we do have enough sources of renewable power within India to at least make sure that most of the power generation is from renewable sources. But in Singapore, that's not possible, right? So what can companies, so net zero could be a mindset that you are trying to get there. But the other mindset some companies have is that you announce net zero, but you actually go for what's called offsets. I don't want to go into too much of discussion about the offsets, because it's as you mentioned, it's an audience who's trying to learn about sustainable businesses in a sense. Offsets are where you actually, and this is, offsets are the whole idea behind what's known as clean development mechanisms under the Kyoto Protocol, where a company in India might implement a green project, and it's sort of made into carbon credits, which is fungible. Fungible means tradable in a market, and a company in the West actually buys it. So they don't actually abate the emissions themselves, but they buy the credits for somebody else having abated. So the hot topic now is creating offset out of natural resources, preserving the forest, and you get credit out of it. I personally don't believe in it. So when you say net zero, it has to be genuinely net zero rather than through offset. But it's more of a mindset, because maybe some companies are doing it because unless they set themselves tough targets, at least they can achieve half of it. So I guess we should not judge any country not to have set the target, and we should not also judge companies that have set targets as well, because ultimately these are just posturing in a sense. Ultimately, what we need to look at is whether what have they achieved 10 years or 20 years from now, rather than what target they set at this moment, right? Some people maybe set realistic targets. Some people set very ambitious targets. In life, generally, it's always better to set stretch goals rather than less ambitious targets. So with that philosophy, I guess it's okay to say that, oh, we want to be net zero, right? So.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor. So last question before we open the stage for our audience to ask questions live to you would be, I guess you already touched on the topic when you discussed the last mile delivery example. So when we view sustainable business, it need not be viewed in isolation because there are third parties involved, as in like the suppliers, the transporters. So how do you think for young people starting out, how do you think that that kind of a sustainable business ecosystem can be created, or at least be tried to achieve when they pursue entrepreneurship?
Yeah. So even forget about entrepreneurship. Even large companies, what they struggle with is within their own four walls. It's a little more easier to implement sustainability because they can clean up the act very quickly. But when they go to their suppliers who are located in remote countries, the suppliers just don't understand it. So it requires a lot more patience to teach them. And what the Japanese manufacturers learned many years ago in automotive industry is that you need to train and educate your suppliers. So what many multinational companies are doing now is that it comes to whether it's uh, the farmers who eventually supply their commodities that they buy, they actually work directly with the farmers to improve their productivity, teach them on how to do drip farming and things like that. So for large companies, the way to go is they need to do a lot more education to be able to convert these smaller suppliers. And of course, suppliers will be reluctant to do it if it's going to cost them more and their margins are squeezed. And the companies also need to be cognizant of that. When they implement processes that are going to make the cost of operations higher for these companies, you need to sort of adequately compensate them. But when you're a startup, of course, this is a much more of a difficult challenge because you are new to the ecosystem and you're maybe some of the players you're working with are established players. So, for example, we go back to that same last mile provider example, and you're actually delivering food from, say, 75 restaurants in Delhi, and some of them are probably small dabas, and some of them are established restaurants, and there are probably other last mile delivery providers. Why did they choose you? They chose you because maybe you are more efficient, or maybe the customer orders come through you. So I guess you need to be patient even with these restaurants. You need to sort of ultimately it comes to people skills, right? Maybe the smaller daba might be the easier one to work with because maybe you can have a connection with them. And if you tell them, oh, Baya, can you actually try to use more sustainable packaging? Of course, you need to be proactive and teach them how to do it. Otherwise, they don't learn it. Maybe with the larger players, it might be difficult. So probably you need to set, especially if it's not within your own control, if you need to do it, you need to set small goals, win them one by one, and then take it over. Because again, as a startup, sustainability is probably the last thing you think because you need to make sure that you get your angel funding, your series one, series two, and things like that. But it's good for entrepreneurs to start thinking about sustainability right from the beginning and infuse that in their mindset because there's no point in say that let me get rich first, let me get the IPO first, and then think about it. And by then it might be too late because it's like saying, oh, let me become healthy only when I get to 45. Until then, I party around, I do all kinds of things. And then by the time it's 45, it's too late because you're already an old dog. You cannot change your habits. So I really liked your question in that sense because it's good to think about it, but you need to also realize that you cannot change the entire world in one day. So you need to be patient and do it sort of gradually.
Thank you so much. And also, this reminds me of one of the campaigns that we had in 2020, wherein we asked all these online delivery platforms like Zomato and Swiggy. I'm not sure if they're in Singapore, but they're in India. So we asked them,
Mhm.
why don't you provide the customers an option to choose if they want their food to be delivered in an eco-friendly manner or in a like regular plastic manner? So
Mhm.
we had a conversation, but things didn't work out. But yeah, so they assure that they'll be working on it, and as soon as like things go ahead, like things might work out. So yeah, but
Mhm.
anyways, as you said, we need to be patient with things. We need to have good skills, good communication with the people involved, and that's one of the key. So now I guess I should invite Supriya Koirala to the stream and request her to have the audience inside. Thank you so much, Supriya. Uh,
Sure. Thank you so much, Dev, and thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful session. Now let's move ahead with the Q&A round, and let me invite Adarsh and Tanya to the stream too.
Hello, sir.
Yeah, yeah, Tanya, let's go ahead with the question.
Hello, Tanya. Hello, Adarsh. Hello,
I
Supriya.
guess the first question is from Tanya, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, I'll. Should I start?
Yeah, yeah. You can give a little bit brief introduction where you live and all that thing, and then you can straight away dive into the question.
All right, sure. Hello, sir. I am Tanya, and I'm currently pursuing my BTech in Environmental Engineering at Delhi Technological University, and I stay in the UAE. The question I wanted to ask you is that with the race to net zero, and the concept of of circular economy is the key to establishing a sustainable business. And I would love to hear your views on the steps any small businesses can imbibe to ensure a circular supply chain.
Okay, so I didn't quite understand your question. You said race to net zero, circular economy. So what exactly is your question?
So my question is that how can small businesses apply, like make their supply chain circular?
Okay, so I'm going to continue with the so what exactly is circular itself is a tough question to. I mean, I actually teach about circular economy, and I have my own passion and definition of what circular economy should be, and I don't want to do that in this session because it will take a long time. Uh, but because we started discussing about so circular economy actually to me my by my definition circular economy means something where a product has gone through one entire consumer cycle, and after the consumer cycle, uh, what happens to the product? Let's say that you think of a refrigerator or white goods. How do you make sure that the product is actually recycled rather than just being thrown away as waste, and as much of the product is reused again, not just as a raw material but as directly being reused and recreated as a fridge again with the minimal amount of energy and money put into it, right? So that's my definition. But coming to your specific question about how can startups actually implement circular economy, is that what you asked, Tanya?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so let me continue with the same theme as what we discussed earlier, because it's better to give a particular context rather than discussing it broadly. So, Dave earlier mentioned about you guys talking to many of these delivery platforms and asking them whether they can be more sustainable in their packaging. So, actually, if you remember the original Mumbai Dabbawala model, maybe you won't remember, but in the 80s and 70s, the dabbawala actually took the dabba with the food from home, took it to the office, and the evening the empty dabbas actually came back, right?
Right.
But my understanding was by the time about 10 or 15 years ago, they stopped bringing the dabbas back on the same day. So every family had have two dabbas. The next morning, when they pick up the second dabba with the food, they return the old dabba, right? So you can actually think of in the narrow context of a delivery platform, you can sort of define circular economy as trying to reduce waste as much as possible. And in this context, you can say, oh, I mean, this would be true by and large in most cities in India as well. People who actually order food from outside, they probably order food quite often, especially in this COVID era. And of course, maybe in the COVID time, there are hygiene issues, and therefore you cannot think of uh, packaging in other packaging. But you could possibly say that if you, let's say, through a particular delivery platform, if you're going to order 20 times a month or 10 times a month, you can say that, oh, if you can keep three different dabbas or a tiffin carrier, we'll actually take it from your home, and we will actually pick the food in those carrier itself and then return it back. But we might not return it back the next day itself. We might, so you need to have more than one tiffin carrier. So you have to invest in that, but eventually, as a customer, you're doing good for the environment, and as a firm, you're doing good for the environment. Then you can look at the routes that you have to take, right? Ultimately, the routes have to be optimized. Reason that the dabbawalas don't come in the evening to return back the dabbas, it was too time consuming and costly from a manpower point of view. So you can actually uh, use a narrower definition of circular economy and say that how can we reduce waste, and as I pointed out, even there it cannot be done by a single company. When you work with partners, you need to sort of figure out how to do it. The challenge is in this context itself, customers, instead of having the convenience of plastic, they need to have dabbas. And a company cannot provide the dabbas. They have to actually buy the tiffin carrier. So you are telling the customer, can you go and buy 2 tiffin carriers? And how much does a steel tiffin carrier cost? And then probably the aluminum shell also. So you're looking at probably a $500 to $1,000 investment. But then look at, I think, I don't know the prices in India, but if I were to go to a sort of a steel vessel shop in India, I don't think it'll cost more than 1,500, I think, even today's prices. But amount of food an average upper middle class person in Mumbai or Delhi will order, one delivery itself will be probably anywhere from 300 to 500 rupees, right? So in 4 or 5 deliveries, you're actually going to spend 1,500 anyway. So in the larger scheme of India, where the income levels have gone up, maybe you cannot get everybody to accept it, and you sort of have to give that solution, other solutions to others. Maybe others might say, oh, can you actually pack it in banana leaf? We are okay with it. Can you reduce the plastics? So these are things that one can explore. Not all solutions will be viable, but you need to sort of brainstorm and try as many as possible and see what works, right, in the particular context in a sense. Hopefully I answered your question, Tanya. I
Yes.
wanted, other than be very generic, so that at least there is some inspiration drawn out of it, right? So
Yeah, sir, I understood it perfectly. Thank you so much.
And this also, just to add on this dabba example, while I was doing my research for the alternatives of plastic packaging, I found out that there are some companies in Germany who are taking up this whole dabba model and like doing a lot of research, putting a lot of resources into building how it can, be more sustainable in contemporary times, how they can put it up as per the modern requirements. So that's really great. But I don't think so. There is still like anything going on in India.
yeah,
for
but,
that
but
matter.
I must remind you that when you buy a second dabba, if you do a life cycle analysis, that's a methodology to evaluate the carbon impact. The steel and the aluminum actually cause a lot of carbon emission. So you have to make sure that once you buy the dabba and the steel, you have to use it as many times as possible. So from a cost point of view, you might recover the benefits in maybe 6 months to 1 year. But from a carbon emissions point of view, it might actually take you 3 or 4 years before you actually, because the plastics that you dispose of create far lesser emissions than a steel dabba in a sense, right? So so when you compare sort of a non-disposable coffee cup in the office or at home compared to a disposable chai cup, I mean, this is what railways have been using in the recent past. I'm told that now India is switching back to mud cups again. So mud cup is an option. I mean, can you do delivery in mud cups that can just be thrown away? But then you have to do some engineering, right? Because it's one thing to buy the chai in a mud cup from a street vendor or in the train, because you just get it in. But when you deliver it, how do you make sure that it doesn't break? So those are questions also you need to look at.
Also, so this also brings to perspective that being a radical anti-plastic person, like not accepting plastic at all, might actually be counterproductive, because you might end up contributing to far more emissions through glass and tin and aluminum boxes than you could have by plastic. So it has to be a very rational and balanced choice that you make.
Yeah. So the plastics by itself is not bad, because plastics actually is required in a lot of. I mean, even the specs we wear, everything we have is plastics. The problem is how is it disposed of? How do we make sure that it can be recycled? In Southeast Asia, except Singapore, most of the lot of plastic goes into the ocean. That's what has been found in the recent past. In India, a lot of the plastics go into the cows' udders and so on, which creates a lot of problems. So plastics by itself is not bad. It's just that countries have not developed waste management systems where the plastics can be recycled properly. So instead of dabbas, there are steel. You could very well have plastic dabbas, but then with spicy Indian food, with a lot of turmeric and so on, maybe steel dabbas are better than plastic dabbas. I mean, that's a different issue. So even for a simple thing like this, you find that suddenly the complexity becomes pretty tough very quickly. And you need to sort of make trade-offs and still feel that you're contributing something positive to the world in a sense. Right?
Thank you so much. Next, we have Adarsh, who is having a question for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
You said before, right, that companies should give back to the society and stuff. So my question is, large companies, for example, the fossil fuel industries. So the main two businesses are petrochemicals for plastics and transport fuel, right? So assuming that in the next 10 years or so, people will move on to electric modes of transport, but plastics are here to stay, correct? So my question is, how do such companies, like who are by nature unsustainable for the environment, contribute to fighting climate change, or becoming more environmentally sustainable and stuff?
Yeah, so sometimes it comes from within and without, in the sense that there's pressure from outside, pressure from within. So, like most human beings and most companies, eventually, initially, we are all in denial, because oil and gas companies are, when you look at, there's a term used in industry called clock speed. If you look at the electronic industry, the clock speed is very high because technology changes very rapidly. But these are industries where technology doesn't change very quickly. They have been around for a long time. But there was a fascinating National Geographic series that was produced about the oil politics and oil economy about 25 years ago. And in that, that's when I learned that actually prior to 1908, or prior to automobile innovation, before IC engines, petrol actually was a waste product. What was most useful was kerosene for lighting street lamps, right? So oil and gas industry has also gone through changes of technology and changes of market demands over a period of time. So the ones that are able to, I mean, in the last 15, 18 months, we have been using this word pivot all the time. The companies that are able to pivot faster and rather than remain in a state of denial will probably move much faster. Except that research in this field is not something where you can produce results overnight, right? So there are lots of people doing research in decarbonization strategy, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen economy, and things like that. And I'll explain hydrogen economy in a moment. So the consensus among the industry observers seems to be that the European oil and gas companies are trying to move faster, accepting the reality and moving faster. The British Petroleum, they call themselves Beyond Petroleum now. The Shell and so on, at least they have established some amount of research and businesses into renewable fuels. For example, Shell, I believe, is already looking at using their gas stations as points where EV vehicles can do recharging, right? So they have a lot of assets. They need to repurpose their assets and pivot their business options. The American companies have been, my understanding is that, been a little bit slower. And you find that recently ExxonMobil sort of went through a revolution where the activist investors sort of forced many of the other larger investment groups like BlackRock to in the selection of the board of directors. The activist investors managed to get into the board. So sometimes the question asked is, if you, as an investor, should you invest in a coal-based company or should you invest in a oil and gas company, right? Let's say you have some savings and you have to invest. And this is a very tough question to answer. Some people say, no, you should not invest in them. Only if you stop investing will it eventually go out of business and you get clean energy. But the other way to argue is that if people who are conscious about sustainability don't invest in these companies, and eventually it's only the investors who are not really worried about sustainability start investing in these companies might never change. So having activities, investors invest in these companies and forcing them to change their technology over a period of time. Of course, some companies might die because they are not able to adapt and find alternative business opportunities. But even if we were to convert the world over, even if we were to convert all our energy use, say, let's not say 100%, say 70% of the energy is produced only from renewable fuels and possibly nuclear, we will still need oil and gas, because if you look at most products that we consume, it is all fossil fuel based. So, but what many of the experts are talking about is a hydrogen economy, where we don't actually produce the plastics and others from oil and gas. Instead, the two key ingredients in many of these downstream oil and gas products is carbon and hydrogen. We find the carbon from carbon capture and storage and other carbon that is being generated from the oil and gas use. And we get hydrogen by electrolyzing water with renewable energy, what is called green hydrogen. So oil and gas companies might still have a role to play in downstream chemical manufacturing, but it's a huge challenge. So the companies that face the biggest challenge are the Gencos, the energy companies, the oil and gas companies, the heavy industries like cement and so on, and airlines, of course. And there's no obvious silver bullet in terms of technology that's available today, which is why many countries are investing into R&D to see whether we can find technologies to address them. Right? Hopefully that answered your question, Adarsh.
Yes, sir.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much,
so much, sir.
Professor. We
So
also
we
have
have
one.
one.
Sorry,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
Supriya.
Go ahead. Okay.
Uh,
So, sir, we also have one question from the audience. So her name is Namya R. Parik. So she is
Mhm.
asking that there are many people who are producing biodegradable bowls from uh, waste or algae, etc. But that requires energy to produce and does not last long, whereas plastic in the long run can be used and provides more utility. So, like, would you say that not at all biodegradable products are actually sustainable?
Yeah, so that's so this is where the controversy starts coming in. So in fact, many years ago, there was a think tank group which said that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with a vehicle called the Hummer, right? The Hummer is sort of like a humongous SUV, a Jeep kind of thing that consumes, probably it has a 5 liter or a 10 liter engine. They actually did a life cycle analysis and said Hummer is more sustainable than a Prius car. Prius is a one of the first generation hybrid that is so in many parts. I drive a hybrid car, by the way, because EV is still too early, because unless there are charging points, and if you live in apartments, you cannot have charging points at home. So hybrid is sort of the intermediate solution before you go to a more sustainable motor vehicle. So to answer her, so what this think tank did was they said Hummer can last for 30 years, whereas the EV battery lasts only for 4 years. And when you do the calculation, it says Hummer is more sustainable than, which was a wrong way to calculate it. So one of the key tools that will be required to evaluate alternatives is what is known as life cycle analysis or life cycle assessment. So life cycle analysis is a tool where this was a tool developed in the 70s primarily to measure environmental pollution of chemical companies, where you look at all kinds of things. So you need to look at how much is the environmental pollution that comes out of it. What are the other externalities? And for plastics, maybe the plastics last for 15 rounds, whereas the biodegradable whatever the bowl that you mentioned lasts only for 1 round, but then it doesn't create any wastage, right? So the energy that is required to produce that, if it is too high, then it's not a good thing. So one has to do that the calculation. So there are articles in most magazines that have looked at plastic cups versus paper cups versus glass cups versus steel cups, for example. And what they found is that if you're using a cup that can be reused several times, you need to make sure that you reuse it as many times as possible. So, I mean, if you have a steel bottle like this, so I have another, this steel bottle is in the office. I have another steel bottle in my office that was bought in 2008. And I'm still using it after 13 years. And I would say, yes, the energy required to make that steel bottle is very high, but if you use it long enough, then the trade-off happens. So it's very difficult to give the answer without knowing the details. But the idea is that one needs to do, and the life cycle analysis doesn't have. First of all, life cycle analysis is not rocket science. It's actually a pretty simple calculation, and you can learn the basics by just sort of searching the internet. And if you're an environmental, I think one of you is studying environmental science, right? I think one of the
Environmental
questions,
engineering. That was Tanya.
Tanya, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm sure in that program they will probably teach life cycle analysis. So life cycle analysis is a tool required to be able to answer that question properly. So sometimes the trade-offs are not very clear, and when you do the analysis, you have to make sure that you capture all the externalities properly, right? So
Supriya, do we have any other questions as of now? Who wants to join us live?
No, no,
Because
no.
I
I
have,
guess we're all done.
yeah, there is one of my friends, Akshat. He couldn't join the live session, but he sent me this question. He's been watching you live over YouTube. So he sent me, can you give him 3 tips for running a sustainable startup in India? Any three tips you would, give to a young person who really wants to get started with his own business, a sustainable business?
Okay, yeah. I must say I'm far away from entrepreneurship, so I'm not sure I can give tips. But I was really inspired because just 2 weeks ago, a couple of my group of MBA students, they participated in a what locally they called a Dean's Social Innovation Challenge, and they took my help in terms of the preparing the pitch and the presentation and so on. And the for this particular challenge, it was to address the plastics problem. So one group was looking at the plastic waste collection in a particular city called Baguio, the second largest city in Philippines. So they actually won the first prize. I mean, my contribution was very limited. I just asked them lots of tough questions and improved their presentation. And they are quite inspired, and they want to see whether they can go back, try take it further. They got a $3,000 prize, but they want to see whether they can actually solve the problem on the ground. So if you were to ask me, assuming that you have interest in sustainability, so the startup itself is, can you actually try to find a business model where you have a model where you can make money in the long run, and also address some of the challenges, right? Maybe one of the SDG challenges or one of the sustainability challenges. If you can do both, then fantastic. So that will be the uh, first advice, that tip I would give. The second tip I would give is, uh, I mean, if once you get into it, you need to have lots of patience, right? Especially, I mean, whether you're starting a for-profit business that's not looking at a sustainability as a solution itself, you need to make sure that you convince enough people to come on board, you get the investments and so on. But the kind of discussion we had about the food delivery, it means that you need to work with multiple stakeholders. So especially in a country like India, where India still lives in its villages, right? Even though there's a huge migration into the cities, and there are lots of problems to address. So, can you actually try to address solutions at the bottom of the pyramid, right? So, maybe that would be the second tip. Find out business models that can make a real change for the people at the ground, rather than, because when I look at, as I said, I'm not a startup person, and when I look at all the startups, the Zomatos, and all the other companies that you mentioned, they all provide solutions for the middle and upper middle class in India. Can you come up with solutions that actually solve the problems of drinking water, the groundwater issues, other things, sanitation issues, hygiene issues, and so on at the ground level? So maybe those are worthwhile problems to work on. And at the end of it, you find that maybe the business didn't survive. At least you feel that you gave it a shot and you gave everything. And the learning experience you get from that will actually, you'll find that you'll still be employable by lots of companies. And there are other standard things that people who are in the startup business will tell you, you need to fail several times before you succeed. But that depends, right? So some of these are very philosophical. And when you're young and you go for a Gita class, and it says, do your duty, don't worry about rewards. At your age, or when I was your age, at least it didn't make sense to me. But now I see that patience is a huge virtue, right? And you need to be grounded on details, right? So I think I already gave you several tips: grounded on details, patience, work on problems that can make a meaningful impact, rather than just chasing some financing model or other things. Do things that makes a difference for the country, right? So.
Thank you so much, Professor, again. So here we come towards the end of the session. It was a very, very lovely conversation with you, wherein we learned a lot, many new things, which were not earlier very clear to us. And I hope for our audience as well, it has been a very insightful session. And before we end, I would like to do certain acknowledgements. First, to the PR team of Svadhyaya Youth Organization, which includes Adarsh, Supriya, and Farhan. who organized this, who came up with Anveshana and organized this session, did all the communications and the technical setup. Many thanks to them. And eventually, like we wish to again extend our heartiest thank you and gratitude for taking out time for this session, because it was the very first session, and it's placed at such a time that today in Glasgow, like world leaders are meeting for COP26, and here we are having our own conversations surrounding sustainable business. So that means a lot to us. This session, for those who could not attend the session, this session would be uploaded on our Instagram IGTV, and at the same time, we would also be creating a Spotify podcast named Anveshana by Svadhyaya Youth Organization, where you can have the audio access. Thank you so much, Professor, once again. It was really lovely to have you here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, and I hope I sort of made at least a small delta difference in your lives by in this 1 hour.
Absolutely, absolutely, you did.
And changed you to inspire, gave you some
And
inspiration. My pleasure.
and
Thank you.
one more thing, that apart from all the technical aspects that we discussed here, I have the pleasure, and rather Supriya, Adarsh, and like three of us have the pleasure of speaking with Professor Viswanathan earlier this week. And what I know is that he is one of the most cheerful, energetic, and all like enthusiastic spirit that I've come across recently. So totally appreciated the kind of comfort that you created so that we were able to have a seamless conversation. Kudos to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, and my pleasure to do this. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Okay.
Thank you so much again. Take care. We would
Thank
be
you.
ending the live session now.
Okay.
Supriya.
Yeah, and thanks to all the audiences who joined us today through YouTube.
Yeah.